Relations between Canada and the United States have historically been extensive, given the two countries' shared border, which is the longest in the world, and ever-increasing cultural and economic ties. The shared historical and cultural heritage has resulted in one of the most stable and mutually beneficial international relationships in the world. For both countries, the level of trade with the other is at the top of the annual combined import-export total. Tourism and migration between the two nations have increased rapport, but border security was heightened after the September 11 terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001. The US is approximately 9.25 times larger in population and has the dominant cultural and economic influence, starting with the American Revolution, when anti-American loyalists fled to Canada. A vocal element in Canada has warned against US dominance or annexation. The War of 1812 saw invasions across the border. In 1815, the war ended with the border unchanged and demilitarized. As were the Great Lakes, the British ceased aiding Native American attacks on the United States, and the United States never again attempted to invade Canada. Apart from minor raids, it has remained peaceful, as Britain decided to disengage. Fears of an American takeover played a role in Canadian Confederation, and Canada's rejection of free trade. Military collaboration was close during World War II and continued throughout the Cold War, bilaterally through NORAD and multilaterally through NATO. A high volume of trade and migration continues between the two nations, as well as a heavy overlapping of popular and elite culture, a dynamic which has generated closer ties, especially after the signing of the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in 1988. The two nations have the world's longest shared border, and also have significant interoperability within the defense sphere. Recent difficulties have included repeated trade disputes, environmental concerns, Canadian concern for the future of oil exports, and issues of illegal immigration and the threat of terrorism. Trade has continued to expand, especially following the 1988 FTA, the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, and the 2020 United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which has progressively merged the two economies. Cooperation on many fronts, such as the ease of the flow of goods, services, and people across borders are to be even more extended, as well as the establishment of joint border inspection agencies, relocation of U.S. food inspectors agents to Canadian plants and vice versa, greater sharing of intelligence, and harmonizing regulations on everything from food to manufactured goods, thus further increasing the American-Canadian assemblage. The foreign policies of the countries have been closely aligned since the Cold War. A diplomatic debate has been underway in recent years on whether the Northwest Passage is in international waters or under Canadian sovereignty. Before the British conquest of French Canada in 1760, there had been a series of wars between the British and the French which were fought out in the colonies as well as in Europe and the high seas. In general, the British heavily relied on American colonial militia units, while the French heavily relied on their First Nation allies. The Iroquois nation were important allies of the British. Much of the fighting involved ambushes and small-scale warfare in the villages along the border between New England and Quebec. The New England colonies had a much larger population than Quebec, so major invasions came from south to north. The First Nation allies, only loosely controlled by the French, repeatedly raided New England villages to kidnap women and children, and torture and kill the men. Those who survived were brought up as Francophone Catholics. The tension along the border was exacerbated by religion. The French Catholics and English Protestants had a deep mutual distrust. There was a naval dimension as well, involving privateers attacking enemy merchant ships. England seized Quebec from 1629 to 1632, and Acadia in 1613 and again from 1654 to 1670. These territories were returned to France by the peace treaties. The major wars were King George's War and the French and Indian War. In Canada, as in Europe, this era is known as the 7 Years' War. New England soldiers and sailors were critical to the successful British campaign to capture the French fortress of Louisbourg in 1745. and to capture it again in 1758. At the outset of the American Revolutionary War, the American revolutionaries hoped the French Canadians in Quebec and the colonists in Nova Scotia would join their rebellion, and they were pre-approved for joining the United States in the Articles of Confederation. When Canada was invaded, thousands joined the American cause and formed regiments that fought during the war. However, most remained neutral and some joined the British effort. Britain Ad.